Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The cemetery where they buried my fear. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Return to Blackwood Cemetery. Eli West gripped the steering wheel as the narrow road twisted through Blackwood's decaying outskirts. Town looked the same, though more hollow than he remembered. Houses leaned, abandoned and tired, their windows blind to the world. He hadn't been back in over 10 years, but nothing about the place had changed, not the faded signs, not the cracked pavement, and certainly not the cemetery that loomed at the edge of town. Its crooked gate, standing half open, as if waiting. His stomach knotted when he passed it. The rows of gravestones were barely visible through the creeping vines and thick overgrowth. A memory flickered, unwelcome, Dylan's laughter echoing through the trees as they dared each other to jump over the headstones. Eli's jaw tightened. Dylan was dead now. Or at least, that's what the police said when they'd found nothing after all those years. The official notice arrived a few weeks ago. No body, just a declaration presumed dead. His therapist had been the one to suggest the trip. Maybe facing it will help you move forward, she'd said. Move forward from what, though? The nightmares? The guilt? He didn't even know anymore. By the time Eli pulled into the gravel driveway of his childhood home, the sky was a dull, overcast gray. The house creaked with age, and the air inside was thick with the smell of dust and disuse. He tossed his bags onto the bed but didn't bother unpacking. What was the point? He wouldn't be here long. That night, sleep came reluctantly, dragging him under in fits and starts. But when it did, the cemetery returned. Eli found himself standing among the gravestones, their cold surfaces damp beneath his fingertips. The air was thick, heavy, and in the distance, he heard the faint sound of someone calling his name. He turned, heart pounding, and there he was, Dylan. His best friend's face was pale, gaunt, but his voice was unmistakable. Eli, his name stretched, warped, carried on the wind. Eli's legs froze in place. Dylan's hand reached from beneath the earth, his fingers clawing through the dirt, desperate. "Help me," he whispered, his voice fading into the darkness. Eli woke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The clock on the wall ticked slowly past 3 a.m., but he could still feel it, the weight of the cemetery, calling him back. Chapter 2. The Whispering Graves. Eli sat up in bed, his chest heaving as if he had run for miles. The nightmare clung to him, its chill seeping into his bones. Dylan's voice echoed in his ears, that desperate whisper still alive in his mind. "Help me." He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the feeling, but the pull of the cemetery gnawed at him. It wouldn't let go. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Eli found himself standing at the cemetery gate. He hadn't planned to come, not this soon, but something about the place felt inevitable. The iron gate groaned as he pushed it open, its rusted hinges protesting, as if the cemetery itself didn't want him there. The air inside was thick, stifling. The graves, overgrown with ivy and tangled weeds, stretched out in uneven rows. Eli's footsteps crunched along the gravel path, but every now and then the sound seemed off, as if the ground was shifting beneath him. He glanced around, a flicker of movement catching his eye. But when he turned, the gravestones sat still, just as they should. He walked deeper, past headstones he vaguely remembered from childhood, until he reached a part of the cemetery that made his skin prickle. An old, weathered tombstone stood crooked under the shadow of a gnarled oak tree. It was cracked and covered in moss, the name long eroded by time. Yet something about it felt familiar, too familiar. A chill ran down his spine as the wind picked up, but it wasn't the wind that made him freeze. Faint whispers floated through the air, too soft to catch at first, like the rustling of leaves. Eli strained to listen, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around him in an eerie dance. He backed away, the feeling of eyes watching him from every direction. His pulse quickened, turned to leave, but before he could take a step, the gate behind him slammed shut with a violent clang. Panic surged in his veins. He rushed toward the gate, tugging at the iron bars, but they wouldn't budge. His breath came in ragged gasps as the whispers grew deafening, pressing in on him. It was then that the memories began to surface, memories he had buried deep, along with the fear that had once consumed him. Eli stumbled back, his childhood fear crawling out of the grave he had left it in. The cemetery wasn't just a place for the dead. It was where his fear had been buried, and now it wanted to be unearthed. Chapter 3. The Buried Memory. Eli stumbled out of the cemetery, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He didn't know how he'd managed to get the gate open, but as soon as it gave way, he ran. His feet carried him instinctively through the overgrown path and back to his childhood home. The whispers had followed him, faint but persistent, clinging to his mind like a shadow he couldn't escape. Inside the house, the silence pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. Eli leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to steady himself, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. The gate slamming shut, the whispers, the creeping sense of something watching him, it all felt too real. Yet, something else gnawed at him, something older, deeper. He couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't the first time the cemetery had sunk its claws into him. He closed his eyes, searching for clarity, but what came were fragmented images. Dylan, the two of them, boys, no older than 10, darting between the gravestones, daring each other to get closer to the darker corners of the cemetery. There was one corner, in particular, farther than they were supposed to go, an area Eli had long forgotten, or maybe chosen to forget. The memory rushed in, sharp and vivid. They had found something that day, hidden in the cemetery's shadows, an ancient crypt, unmarked and half-buried beneath the twisted roots of an oak tree. Eli's breath hitched. He could almost feel the cool stone under his hand, see the faint carvings that decorated the entrance, symbols that neither of them could understand. "What do you think's inside?" Dylan had asked, his voice a mix of excitement and fear. Eli remembered their hesitation, the chill in the air as they debated going in. But the curiosity had been too much. They'd stepped inside the crypt, the dark swallowing them whole. And then something else. His mind blurred, struggling to recall the rest. He could see flashes, the cold, damp walls, Dylan's face pale and terrified, whispers surrounding them, louder than ever before. Then nothing. A black void where the rest of the memory should be. Eli opened his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead. That crypt they'd sworn never to speak of it again, and they hadn't. But now, standing in his childhood home, it felt like the cemetery had never forgotten. It had waited, biding its time, until he returned. His hands trembled as another thought crept in, more disturbing than the rest. What if this wasn't just memory? What if something from the crypt had followed them out? Something they'd left buried, but not forgotten. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Or had they unearthed something far worse all those years ago? Chapter 4. The Digging Begins. Eli sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the shovel propped against the wall. The dreams hadn't stopped. Every night, Dylan's voice called out from beneath the earth, his words twisting into desperate pleas that echoed in Eli's skull long after he woke. And each morning, The pull to return to the cemetery grew stronger, like a rope tightening around his chest. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The sun was setting by the time Eli found himself back at the cemetery. The place was even more unsettling at dusk, shadows stretching between the gravestones like grasping fingers. He stood at the gate, his heart thudding in his chest. His hands tightened around the wooden handle of the shovel. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the urge to dig had become a compulsion he couldn't resist. Something was waiting for him under that earth, and he needed to know what it was. The spot came to him instinctively, an overgrown patch near the old oak tree, where the crypt had once loomed large in his memory. He hesitated for a moment, then drove the shovel into the ground. The dirt was looser than he expected, almost as if the earth had been disturbed recently, though no one had been here in years. He dug faster, the cool air around him growing thick and oppressive. As the hole deepened, strange things began to happen. The ground beneath his feet shifted, unnatural, like it was breathing. Eli paused, his breath catching in his throat. The faint sound of Dylan's voice drifted up from the hole, barely audible but unmistakable. Eli. It was a whisper, drawn out like a plea, filled with pain. Eli's hands trembled. He kept digging, throwing dirt aside in frantic motions until his shovel hit something solid. His heart raced as he uncovered old relics, faded toys, bits of metal, fragments of childhood memories buried in the earth. Then his shovel scraped against something different, a small, rotting wooden box. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as he pried the box from the soil. It was old, the wood damp and decayed. He hesitated only a second before forcing it open. Inside was a blood-stained handkerchief, the cloth stiff with age. Eli's throat tightened. Underneath it lay a piece of folded paper, yellowed with time. His hands shook as he unfolded it, his breath catching when he saw the single word scrawled across the page in bold, jagged letters: liar. A wave of nausea hit him. The memories flooded back in sharp, painful fragments. That day in the cemetery, there had been someone else with them. Someone they hadn't spoken about. Someone who had been there when Dylan disappeared. Eli stumbled back, the paper clutched in his hand. He wasn't just unearthing childhood fears. He was unearthing the truth. And it was far worse than anything he could have imagined. Chapter 5. The Gravedigger's Secret. Eli stood on the porch of the gravedigger's cottage, his knuckles white as he knocked on the weathered door. The old house sat on the edge of the cemetery, its sagging roof and boarded windows, a reflection of the decay that clung to Blackwood. He didn't know why he was here, only that something inside him said Mr. Grayson might have answers Eli was terrified to hear. The door creaked open, revealing Mr. Grayson as gnarled and weathered as the land itself. His face was lined with age, his eyes dull and tired, but there was something sharp about him, like he knew too much. "What do you want, boy?" His voice was a rough scrape, low and cold. Eli hesitated, unsure of where to start. "I need to know about the cemetery." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "You came here about the dead, didn't you?" Eli swallowed, glancing back toward the cemetery, the weight of the blood-stained handkerchief and the note still heavy in his mind. "There's something wrong with it. I think it's cursed." Grayson's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You're just now figuring that out?" He stepped back, motioning for Eli to come inside. The interior was dark, cluttered with dusty books and odd trinkets. Things don't stay buried in Blackwood Cemetery. Never have, never will. Eli felt a chill creep over him. "What do you mean?" Grayson sighed, settling into an old, creaky chair. "This land, it's older than the town. It's always been a place for people to bury more than just bodies. Fear, guilt, secrets. Folks thought they could bury their worst memories here, but fear doesn't stay buried. boy. Not here. Eli's stomach tightened. What happened to Dylan? What we found was that part of the curse. Grayson's gaze darkened. The land, don't forget. Whatever you buried, it's been waiting. Watching, he paused, his expression grim. There's power in that soil. It digs into you, twists your mind, makes you see things, hear things. Eli felt the room close in on him, his heart thudding against his ribs. The dreams, the whispers, the crypt, it was all connected. What did we unearth? Grayson leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. You unearthed something that should have stayed dead. And now it's come back for you. Eli's pulse quickened. This wasn't just in his head. The cemetery had power. It had taken Dylan, and now it wanted him too. Chapter 6, The Night of Terror. Eli couldn't breathe. Every inch of his house felt alive with something he couldn't see. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, but when he turned, they vanished. Objects shifted. His keys weren't where he left them. The photos on the wall were crooked, and the door that led to the basement creaked open on its own. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head, but the fear that wrapped around his chest made it impossible to believe. He hadn't slept in days. The nightmares had become relentless, crawling out of the dark and clinging to him long after he woke. Dylan's face haunted him, pale and terrified, calling out for help that never came. You left me. Eli gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, staring at the reflection in the window. A shadow darted behind him, but when he turned, nothing was there. His heart pounded, and he could hear his own ragged breath filling the silence of the house. The cemetery was no longer content to stay in its place. It had followed him here, invading every part of his life. His guilt gnawed at him, a constant presence in his mind, whispering the same thing over and over. You left him. The truth, long buried, was clawing its way to the surface. He remembered now. The crypt, the terror. That night, when Dylan had begged to go back, he had wanted to fix what they had uncovered, but Eli hadn't listened. He had run, his own fear driving him out of the cemetery, leaving Dylan behind. And now, all these years later, the cemetery had come for him, too. Eli grabbed the shovel, his hands trembling as he stormed out of the house. The night air was thick, pressing down on him as he approached the cemetery. His heart raced, and the whispers started again, rising like a dark tide in his mind. Liar. The cemetery gate swung open with a groan, welcoming him back into its embrace. As he walked among the gravestones, the voices grew louder, a cacophony of fear and guilt, pulling him deeper. The ground trembled beneath his feet, as if the earth itself was alive, shifting and stirring. Eli reached the old oak tree, the spot where it all began. His chest tightened as the whispers swirled around him, and the crypt loomed in the distance, half hidden in shadow. This time, he wasn't running. This time, he was going to face it. Whatever it was that waited for him in the dark, he was ready. Chapter 7. The Crypt Opens. Eli stood before the crypt. The heavy stone door cracked open, as though it had been waiting for him all this time. A cold gust of wind blew from its depths, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The darkness inside seemed to pulse, alive with the same whispers that had haunted him for days. Liar, coward. The words circled him, louder now, as if the crypt itself was speaking. His legs felt like lead as he stepped forward, the shovel hanging loosely in his hand. The door groaned open with a slow, deliberate creak, though no one was there to move it. Eli swallowed hard, forcing himself to cross the threshold. As soon as he did, the world shifted. The crypt wasn't just stone walls and dust. Inside, reality itself fractured. Visions of his past flooded the space, flickering like a broken film reel. He saw himself and Dylan as children, running between gravestones, their laughter echoing through the cemetery. Then, the image shifted. The laughter stopped, replaced by Dylan's terrified scream as he was dragged into the crypt's shadowy maw. Ellie's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't just left Dylan behind. He'd run. He'd fled while something ancient and malevolent had claimed his friend. Because of me. The truth settled over him, heavy and suffocating. The crypt had been feeding on his fear ever since. The walls around him seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the lungs of a great beast. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. You abandoned him. Eli pressed forward, deeper into the crypt, the shadows twisting into grotesque figures that clawed at him as he passed. The air was thick with dread, every step more difficult than the last. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, like it might give way at any moment. His pulse raced, his chest tight with the weight of his terror. In the heart of the crypt, he saw it the thing that had taken Dylan. It stood in the center of the chamber, a mass of writhing darkness, its form barely distinguishable, but its presence overwhelming. The shadows around it writhed and shifted, grotesque faces forming and dissolving as if they were made of the same stuff as the crypt itself. And there, just beyond the creature, was Dylan. His face pale, his eyes hollow. He was trapped, frozen in time, just as Eli had left him. Eli felt the weight of his own guilt crushing him. This place, it fed on fear, on the worst memories, on buried guilt. He'd run from this moment once, but now the crypt demanded more than fear. It demanded him. The whispers reached a fever pitch. Fight or succumb. Eli's heart pounded in his ears as he stepped forward, closer to the thing that had destroyed his life. It wasn't just about Dylan anymore. It was about facing the truth, or losing himself to the darkness forever. Chapter 8. The Cemetery's Price. The darkness pressed in around Eli, suffocating as the creature loomed before him, an entity formed from centuries of fear, guilt, and buried secrets. It writhed in the heart of the crypt, a grotesque mass of shadows, its shape shifting constantly, like the nightmare that had haunted his mind for so long. The whispers echoed off the cold stone walls, louder now, insistent. You left him. You're nothing but a coward. Eli's knees buckled as he stared into the creature's depths. His pulse pounded in his ears, and his vision blurred, but he forced himself to stand. He could feel the weight of the guilt dragging him down, pulling him toward the darkness. Visions flashed before his eyes, Dylan's terrified face, his hand reaching out for help, and Eli, frozen, too scared to move, too scared to fight. I'm sorry, Eli whispered, but his voice was swallowed by the crypt. The entity swelled, its grotesque form shifting, its many mouths grinning with malice. Sorry, it spoke, the voices layered in a chorus of torment. Sorry doesn't change what you did. You ran. You abandoned him. Eli's chest tightened as the creature unleashed a wave of memories, moments from that night in the cemetery, fragments of fear and guilt that Eli had tried so hard to bury. He saw himself running through the graveyard, not looking back. He saw Dylan, dragged into the crypt's maw, calling out for help that never came. But then, through the haze of fear, Eli realized something. He had been running from his guilt all this time, terrified to face the truth. But now, standing here in the crypt, at the center of it all, he understood that the only way to defeat this entity was to stop running. He dropped the shovel, his hands trembling, and took a deep breath. I'm not afraid of you anymore, he said, his voice stronger now. I was scared. I made a mistake, but I'm not running from it. Not anymore. The creature recoiled, the shadows swirling with rage. Crypt trembled, cracks forming in the walls as the entity's power began to wane. The whispers faltered, growing weaker with every word Eli spoke. "I forgive myself," Eli said, louder this time, stepping toward the creature. "I forgive myself for what happened to Dylan." With those words, the entity let out a deafening scream, its form unraveling, dissolving into the darkness that had once consumed the crypt. The ground beneath Eli's feet shuddered, and for a moment, he thought the entire cemetery might collapse. But then, everything grew still. The power that had held him in its grasp for so long was gone. Eli staggered out of the crypt, the cool night air hitting his face as he emerged into the cemetery. He could feel the weight lifting from his chest, the guilt that had plagued him for so many years, finally beginning to fade. The whispers were gone, and the night was silent. But as he approached the gate, something caught his eye, a figure standing at the edge of the graveyard. Ellie froze. It was Dylan. He stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on Eli. His expression wasn't one of relief or peace. It was filled with accusation, a silent reminder of everything Eli had tried to forget. Eli's heart sank. He had faced one fear, but the cemetery still held others. As he stared at Dylan's ghostly form, a chilling realization settled over him. No one ever truly leaves Blackwood Cemetery. Not completely.